Hello, ESANN audience. My name is Matthias Buchlacher, and today I will present work from the Cognitive Neuroscience Lab at the University of Tübingen. The topic is how hierarchical representations can be used to make autonomous systems for pathfinding more efficient and more rapid. What makes the brain capable of solving extremely complex problems? A key concept identified in many previous studies is the concept of hierarchical problem decomposition. In spatial navigation, which is what we are looking at, this would be as when I am trying to navigate here from my PhD position in Amsterdam to my Swabian hometown in southern Germany. I'm not immediately aware of every exact step that I will be taking, but instead I break the problem down. I try to navigate within Amsterdam to reach the train. Then I'm staying on the train until I reach Frankfurt, where I change trains and another train journey begins. So I break it down into clear segments, and I represent these segments again in an abstracted manner to form a hierarchical representation of the problem space. And now the question is how such a hierarchical representation can be transferred to make autonomous systems smarter. One approach to do this in reinforcement learning is hierarchical reinforcement learning. And we are using a contrasting approach here built on neural networks inspired by the neurobiology of spatial cognition. And it would be really interesting to talk to you in the Q&A about what people from the engineering side, from the application-oriented side, think of our proposal, and whether you think that this could actually improve systems for autonomous planning. Let me quickly show you the key components of our model. The model is built on state action representations of space, in which neurons represent objects in the environment and connections between neurons represent transition actions. Then this state action network is extended by adding a second layer of so-called region neurons that represent extended areas in space. And lastly, planning and navigation in the network is achieved through so-called synaptic vector fields, a concept built on spiking neurons that allows rapid and energy efficient planning and could in theory be implemented in neuromorphic hardware. Let me begin by going a little bit more into detail of each of these model components. First of all, state action networks. It's an old concept, but it has been recently implemented in a model from our research group. And the core idea behind state action networks is that individual neurons represent objects in the environment, meaning they become active when the agent navigating through an environment encounters a certain object. And then transition actions between the objects are encoded in the connection between these neurons. So let me give you an example. As before, I'm trying to navigate from my home to the train station. So I would have a neuron representing the exit door of my house then, and a neuron representing the next crossroad towards the train station. And the synaptic connection between these neurons would then correspond to the vectorial action that I have to execute, the vector that I have to follow to get from my door to this first crossroad, and so on. So the neurons and the connections form then a topological representation of space. This is the idea of state action networks. And now we took this as fundamental and added another layer of neurons representing extended parts in the environment, representing, for example, the environment around my house, and another neuron representing the neighborhood around the train station. So the network then becomes multi-layered with so-called region neurons in the second layer representing extended areas in space. And as you can see here, there can also be overlap between different areas. Now that we have the multi-layered network, let me explain to you how we are now planning from A to B. And the concept of planning is called synaptic vector fields and has been invented by Ponulac and Hopfield. And I will quickly demonstrate to you how this works. We have an example here, a T-shaped environment in which an agent is trying to navigate, an agent that could be located, for example, here in the corner of that environment, and he's trying to navigate towards the goal shown in turquoise. And upon planning towards the goal, a wave of activity is released throughout the neurons encoding the environment. So this whole environment is encoded by a network of neurons, and now a wave of activity spreads from the goal throughout the network. You can see here active neurons shown in red, and the wave front, as time passes on, traverses throughout the network. And as it traverses, it changes synaptic weights. And it changes them by strengthening synaptic weights pointing towards the origin of the wave. Thus, a synaptic vector field is created in which strong weights are pointing towards the goal. And in detail, this works by so-called spike timing dependent plasticity. If we look at two neurons interconnected, neuron 1 and neuron 2, and first neuron 1 spikes and then neuron 2, the timing dependent plasticity rule strengthens the opposing connection from neuron 2 to neuron 1. And now you can see how the passage of the wavefront can strengthen weights in the direction of the goal. Now, how does the agent know in which direction to go? This fit really well together with our understanding of the state action networks, because now the agent can simply conduct a voting process over all synapses in its vicinity. And as we have seen, synapses pointing towards the goal are associated now with a stronger weight, so they dominate the voting process. And thus, the result of the voting process will be an action leading the agent straight towards the goal. Now we have all key components of the model. Let me quickly summarize. The model is built on a state action network, which is then extended by adding region neurons to represent larger areas in space. And lastly, planning in the network is conducted through synaptic vector fields. Wavefronts propagate from the goal and strengthen synaptic connections pointing towards the goal. Let me show you an example. We have an agent marked by an arrow who's trying to navigate to a goal shown by a circle here. And the direct connection between agent and goal is now blocked through an obstacle. So as the agent plans its way to the goal, the wave of activity spreads from the goal, and now it cannot get through the obstacle, so it has to travel around the obstacle. And as this wavefront travels, it builds again the synaptic vector field, strengthening the connections towards the goal. As you can see, the result of the wavefront traveling around the obstacle is also that the synaptic vector field is pointing around the obstacle and not directly towards the goal. And in the navigation phase, the agent then neatly follows this vector field to reach the goal in the end. You can see here also the bump of activity around the position of the agent, which is shown by active neurons. They're shown in yellow here, and inactive neurons in red. And as you can see, objects close to the agent activate their representations, and objects further away are not activated. This can be called a population code of the agent's position in the environment. So we know now that state action networks work in combination with synaptic vector fields. But our core hypothesis was whether hierarchical representations facilitate this planning. So we tried to investigate this in a new simulation experiment. And in this simulation experiment, we set up different networks. A network without hierarchical structure, all the way on the left, a network in the center with hierarchical representation of relatively large regions, and another network with smaller regions in the hierarchical representation. You can see the region neurons shifted a little bit to the right, the 3x3 grid in the center and the 4x4 grid on the right. And now we activated in each network the neuron on the top right corner. Let the wave of activity spread throughout the network. You can see again active neurons shown in yellow, so you can see where the wave of activity is currently, 30 milliseconds after release of the wavefront. And as you can see, the single level network on the left, the wavefront has only propagated about halfway through it, whereas in the hierarchical networks in the center and on the right, the wave is much further already, showing that the hierarchical networks have a much faster capability for planning than single-level networks. We now wanted to investigate the influence of region size on this planning speed. So what we show here is planning time on the y-axis for different network types. For a single-level network and for 3 hierarchical networks with varying sizes of regions. 2x2 corresponds here to having relatively large regions, 3x3 smaller, and 4x4 relatively small regions. And if we look at the planning time, we see this the large decrease going from the single level to the multi-layer networks, but then again an increase in planning time as region size decreases. And what we can learn from this is that having fewer, larger regions gives us a faster planning process than having a more fragmented representation with more and smaller regions. Let me conclude now. We have extended state action networks to represent space on multiple levels of scale. We have then added a biologically plausible planning rule through synaptic vector fields and found that hierarchical networks perform planning much faster than single-level networks. Future work could address how such a system could be implemented in a neuromorphic chip. So there are now companies developing spiking neuromorphic hardware with on-chip learning, where this system could be implemented very energy efficiently and very rapidly. Furthermore, future work could address how these networks can be learned. All work I've showed you here were hardwired networks, but a colleague of mine, Tristan Baumann, has found how single-layer state action networks can be learned in an unsupervised manner. And with this, I'm at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you in the Q&A, where we could, for example, talk about experiments that we have conducted to compare model behavior to human behavior in regionalized environments, and found that under some circumstances, our model replicates human behavioral biases to choose certain routes over others in hierarchical representations, strengthening the biological plausibility. On the engineering side, I would look forward to hear from you what you think about the applicability of the system to exploit hierarchical representations. Thank you very much, and see you in the Q&A.